How narcissistic abuse makes it hard to recognize safe people. In order for scapegoat survivors of narcissistic abuse to realize that they're now safe to unmute, things have to be different. They've learned to mute when they had to stay in relationship to a parent who required this form of muting. And attempts at unmuted living were punished via parental rejection or withdrawal. Scapegoat children learn that unmuting damages their most important relationship. So a key part of recovery is making sure that you're now surrounded by relationships that are enhanced when you unmute yourself. Gaining distance from narcissistic abusers and closeness to safe people promotes this. In order to do this, we need to evaluate who is safe and who is not. And this is a lot easier said than done for scapegoat survivors. We all have to bond with our parents as infants. It's just necessary for survival. But as we grow up, we evaluate the character of the person that we've bonded with. And in most cases, what we learn is not that incompatible with our initial bond. The parent shows themselves to be loving, supportive, and protective enough that the child finds they have blindly bonded with a safe person, at least in retrospect. Such children learn that evaluating others leads to the kinds of bonds that they enjoyed with their parent. Not so for the scapegoat child of a narcissistic parent. Yes, this child bonds right out of the womb with their parent, but as they grow up, the information they find out about their parent's character is incompatible with that bond. This child encounters a parent who devalues, deprives, and domineers them. A parent who must always feel and seem superior to be psychologically intact, and a parent who needs this child to always feel and seem inferior. Honestly evaluating their parent then interferes with the child's good faith in that parent. The child's evaluation might also puncture the parent's emotional thin skin. So the scapegoat child is motivated to be wary of their own powers of evaluating others' character. They've learned that no one in their life can pass their honest evaluation. So if they don't mute such awareness, then they risk having no viable parent in a psychological sense, which would lead to that terrible outcome of becoming nobody to no one. Well, in today's video, I want to show how the scapegoat child of a narcissistic parent has to mute their evaluations of their parent's character to stay bonded with that parent. This survival tactic later becomes a challenge in the scapegoat survivor's attempts to recover from this abuse. They've learned to bond before evaluating whether others are safe to bond with. How are they supposed to now know who is safe to move towards while doing the opposite with unsafe people? It is, though, possible to overcome the post-traumatic lesson that evaluating others can lead to having no one. And this is best done in therapy. I'll explain how scapegoat survivors can use therapy to gradually learn that they're now safe to evaluate others before bonding with them. Recovering this ability makes it possible to put the second pillar of recovery into practice. My name is Reid, and I'm a practicing licensed psychotherapist in California and a scapegoat survivor myself. I've worked to understand what helps scapegoat survivors know that they are now safe to unmute what they need, what they want, and what they really think. And this has led me to what I've called the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 is to make sense of the abuse to know that it was not your fault. Pillar number 2 is to gain distance from narcissistic abusers today and closeness with safe people. And pillar number 3 is to live in defiance of the narcissistic abuser's rules. And if you're interested in a low-cost option to understand and apply these 3 pillars of recovery in your own life, then I suggest checking out my Rise and Reclaim Healing Toolkit for Scapegoat Survivors. In it, you'll receive my book called Growing Up as the Scapegoat Child to Narcissistic Parents, A Guide to Healing. This book is a comprehensive and in-depth guide to these 3 pillars of recovery. And if you're a scapegoat survivor, you'll likely find a lot of your own experience in these pages. Most importantly, you'll see how to apply the 3 pillars so that you can reclaim the quality of life that you deserve. And in the toolkit, you'll also receive a worksheet that asks you to brainstorm ways to apply these pillars on a monthly basis in your life. You can find the link to the toolkit in the description box below or by clicking here. How bonding and evaluation are supposed to work. Well, babies are unconditionally dependent on their caregivers. Babies are in no position to impose conditions upon which they will and will not depend on their caregivers. So a toddler can't say or even think that they're not going to get close to a parent who, say, handles them roughly. The toddler has to find a way to stay close to and stay dependent on that caregiver. Children are then vulnerable to the character of the people that they are born to. The child is going to have to bond with that parent either way, and hopefully they'll get to bond to an adult of good enough character. As the child grows, they are able to perceive and process a lot more information about their parent. They can register how they feel in relationship to this parent, they can know how this parent treats them, and they can assess what makes that parent tick. If their parent measures up fairly well, then the child's evaluation of the parent's character will not conflict with their bond. Children in this position can safely use their evaluative capabilities. Doing so, the child has learned, leads them to the kinds of safe people that their parent turned out to be. The child in this position doesn't evaluate their parent to be perfect by any means. They likely notice very real shortcomings in the parent. But good enough parents like this aren't destabilized by accurate captures of their fallibility. They don't expect perfection from themselves. And this reinforces to the child that they're now safe to know all there is to know about the parent. That doing so doesn't irreparably harm their faith in the parent, nor damage the parent's own self-regard. In short, the child doesn't lose their parent in that psychological sense when they honestly evaluate them. So let's illustrate with an anonymized case example. Matt was born to a mother who had a big heart, yet could accept her limitations. She worked hard at her job at a marketing firm. And when she gave birth to Matt, she took maternity leave and they forged a very close bond. She was very curious about who Matt was and who he would develop into. She attuned herself to his needs when they were together, and she instinctively read his nonverbal cues to know what he wanted in different moments. Rubbing his eyes usually meant Matt was sleepy, and she'd encourage him to get ready for bed. Looking around alertly meant Matt wanted stimulation, and she'd find a toy or project they could work on together. Matt developed the implicit sense that he was accompanied in life by a generally kind and protective mother. As Matt grew older and entered elementary school, he got to see other sides of his mother. She had advanced at her job and it was requiring more of her time. Matt had started to play soccer and hoped that she would attend his games. She tried to, but could only make it to about 1 out of every 3 games. Matt felt a bit crestfallen when he'd look to the sidelines and not see her. On those days, he'd come home and tell her how he wished she could have seen him play that day. She showed him genuine remorse and wanted to know more about how he felt when she wasn't there. Matt would tell her, and after a few moments, he then just organically shifted to talking about how the game went for him and what he was excited about. Matt's relationship with his mother exemplifies the way bonding and evaluation are supposed to work. He enjoyed a safe and loving experience with his mother throughout infancy. This gave way to a continued safe experience as a toddler and young boy. As he grew, the lessons he learned about who his mother was largely measured up to how his bond felt with her. She wasn't perfect, but she also wasn't upset by his noticing her imperfections. How bonding and evaluation work for the scapegoat child. To quickly review, the scapegoat child serves as the parent's emotional waste bin for all the feelings the parent doesn't want to feel. The most common set of feelings that the narcissistic parent throws the scapegoat child's way are those of worthlessness. The narcissistic parent unconsciously relocates their feelings into the child. Then they influence the child to think and act as if these feelings were the child's own. And here's where those 3 Ds come in of devaluation, deprivation, and domineering. It's easy for a child getting a steady diet of these 3 Ds to conclude that they don't deserve anything better. At this point, the parent has successfully scapegoated their child and protected themselves from feeling those feelings of worthlessness that they don't want to feel. The ways that the scapegoat child is mistreated can't deter them from seeking and protecting a bond with their parent. The scapegoat child must try harder than children with good enough parents to maintain that bond. They have to put information out of awareness that could compromise their bond to their parent. Here's where it gets dangerous for the scapegoat child to honestly evaluate their narcissistic parent. Evaluating this parent conflicts with the mandate that the scapegoat child stay bonded to them. Honestly assessing a parent who, say, devalues them might make it hard to stay bonded to that parent. It could also offend the narcissistic parent who might need to insist that they're a perfect parent. Such parents typically have thin emotional skin and would readily lash out at any indication that their child isn't finding them to be perfect. The scapegoat child's honest evaluation wouldn't fit in the parent's reality. According to the parent, they are flawless, and it's the scapegoat child who is defective. Therefore, the child has no right to critically evaluate the parent. If the child doesn't abide and therefore steps out of the parent's reality, then the child can feel like nobody to no one. On the other hand, the parent who detects emergent self-worth in the scapegoat child might also feel like nobody to no one, because they've lost the supposed inferior person to whom they need to feel superior to. The difference, though, for the parent in this position is that they have the power to change it. They can devalue, deprive, and domineer the child all the more intensely to coerce that child back into the role of being the worthless one. So, both scapegoat child and narcissistic parent are motivated to keep the child's honest evaluations of the parent muted. So let's look at a different anonymized case example to illustrate this dynamic. Chris was the scapegoat child to a narcissistic mother. Initially, she was taken by Chris and the admiration that he afforded her amongst her friends and when they were in public. But once Chris turned 3 years old, he developed his own will, and this infuriated her. She took his very developmentally appropriate efforts to say no as challenges to her authority. She intended to crush his supposed rebellion. This led to a campaign of treating Chris like there was always something wrong with him. She'd criticize his body, his character. She'd make jokes at his expense and openly tell anyone else who would listen how difficult her son was. Chris began to feel and think of himself as someone people didn't like when they got to know him. Chris, though, had one friend when he was 7 years old named Joshua. Joshua's mother never bothered them when Chris went over there after school to play. Instead, she seemed excited to see the two of them when they got home from school. She also took a liking to Chris. She'd marvel at how well they played together, and she'd notice what was good about Chris. She might tell him how thoughtful he was to let Joshua's little brother play with them. Chris wasn't used to a mother paying attention to him, nor telling him that they liked what they saw. The more time Chris spent at Joshua's house, the more he began to question how he was treated in his own home. One day when his mother started yelling at him for not putting a sock away in his drawer, he turned around and said to her, "Stop yelling at me. I don't like it. It hurts my feelings. Joshua's mother never does that to him or to me." His mother looked at Chris like she had seen a ghost. Suddenly, the boy who had always allowed her to offload whatever bad feelings she didn't want to feel wasn't making himself available to do this. This would not do. It threatened to put her back in touch with her own dreaded bad feelings. In a real way, she didn't recognize this version of Chris. He was not being who she needed him to be, therefore he couldn't exist to her. Chris also felt jolted after saying this. He knew that he'd knocked his mother off of her spot. He didn't feel like the same son to her that he usually was, and this concerned him in a very deep and even scary way. He wanted to do whatever it would take to go back to how things usually were. His mother was about to present such an opportunity. She bore down on him and told him, "You will not talk to me like that in my own house. Joshua's mother only treats you so well because you don't show her how disrespectful you are. No, you save that for me. And if she knew, I'm quite sure she'd be reacting the same way as I do. Now you're going to pick up this sock like I asked you to. Oh, and you're not going to see Joshua for the next month." As bad as Chris felt, he was also strangely relieved that his mother had put things back to where they typically were in their relationship. Chris learned in traumatic fashion how scary it can be to evaluate his mother. He determined not to ever do that again. He just felt too off balance inside, and something really terrible seemed to have been set off in his mother. Chris preferred the ongoing diminishment she leveled at him rather than setting off the volcano that had erupted that day with his negative, though very honest, evaluation of how she treated him. What happens when evaluation stays muted in adulthood? Well, scapegoat survivors who've had to mute their real evaluations of other people have to rely solely on their feelings about others. Survivors may move towards people who make them feel good, and this can happen in a variety of ways. Another person may shower the scapegoat survivor with praise and admiration, or someone else may evoke admiration from the scapegoat survivor. Yet another might be very funny and good at making the survivor laugh. And these traits are in no way inherently bad. The problem can be that the scapegoat survivor can decide that people who do one or more of these things are entirely good to get close to. They may find it difficult to consider other information about someone, such as how does this person treat people who can't do anything for them? Or does this person share their personal challenges with me as I do with them? Or is this person consistent in their words and actions across time and situations? These kinds of questions were forbidden from thinking and asking about their parent in childhood. When scapegoat survivors can only use their feelings of bonding to see who to include in their lives, they can risk including the wrong people, as it were. It can become a roll of the dice as to who they end up being close to. This can result in a wide variety of quality of friends and partners. Survivors may grow confused as to why they have some narcissistically abusive people in their lives alongside other otherwise safe people. The survivors may also stressfully conclude that they can't trust their own judgment about other people. The ongoing danger of evaluating others. Despite how much trouble relying on their feelings can create, scapegoat survivors may fear that if they listen to their own evaluations, then they again will be left with no one. They may assume that their standards are just impossible to meet. That if they did insist on these standards, three things could happen. First, they would be acting unreasonably because their critical evaluations of others have no basis. Second, they would cut everyone out of their life because nobody would pass their evaluation. And third, they'd be crushed by their own guilt for supposedly visiting such harm upon these unsuspecting others. In short, scapegoat survivors have grown to see their own powers of evaluation to be way more destructive and untrustworthy than they actually are. How muted evaluations impact the scapegoat survivor's inner life? Well, interactions with people can feel enslaving because the scapegoat survivor doesn't have the freedom of thought to evaluate whether they like what they're seeing from the other person or not. They can feel like they have to like what they see, and if they don't, then there's something wrong with them, not with the other person. So the scapegoat survivor can coerce themselves to laugh at or admire other people far more eagerly than they really want to. It can just feel way too dangerous to do anything else. As a result, interactions can feel scripted and absent of vitality for the scapegoat survivor. After all, it's never their turn to say what they really think about the other person. So this can feel like being pushed around on the inside and understandably lead to resentment of others. But it's a private resentment that feels too dangerous to express, which can then yield more resentment. So it all can become a vicious cycle. One way scapegoat survivors may try to interrupt this cycle is by isolating from other people. Since interactions can feel like they're a no-win proposition, they might as well avoid them altogether. As compassionately understandable as this logic is, it runs the risk of reinforcing the conclusion that it's not safe to evaluate other people. The reason is that the potential babies get thrown out with the bathwater in this strategy. Sure, there are people who will not tolerate being honestly evaluated, just like their narcissistic parent. To run into these people would definitely feel bad for the scapegoat survivor. But at the same time, there are people who would welcome such evaluation. Socially isolating means that the scapegoat survivor would miss out on connecting with these types of people and getting to then have much needed corrective experiences with them. So let's illustrate and go back to Chris. As an adult in his 20s, he found himself in friendships and relationships more based on whoever showed an interest in bonding with him. The friend he spent the most time with, Harry, was someone who showed a lot of interest in becoming Chris's friend. Chris wasn't too sure whether Harry was the kind of guy he wanted to hang out with, but he had no idea how to find out without potentially committing what felt like the cardinal sin of rejecting Harry's offer of friendship. So Chris went along with Harry's designs of them becoming friends. Unfortunately for Chris, he went on to discover that once Harry thought they were friends, he felt free to put Chris down in a variety of ways. Harry would harp on small mistakes that Chris might make by trying to turn them into an ongoing joke. For his part, Chris didn't like how Harry was treating him, but he wasn't sure if it was reasonable to express this. Chris was too unfamiliar with his evaluative powers to trust that they would lead him somewhere good. So he told himself that Harry's insults were not a big deal and he was just being too sensitive if he found them offensive. Chris didn't want to keep hanging out with Harry, but felt extremely guilty if he didn't. He decided to withdraw from everyone in his life as a supposedly deserving punishment for not wanting to hang out with someone who was only trying to be his friend, that is, Harry. Although Chris was moving away from someone, Harry, he found unsafe, he still had to comply with the belief that his evaluation of others was unreasonable and destructive. So isolating himself from all of his social connections reflected this belief. Restoring your ability to evaluate others so that you can execute pillar number 2. Well, the point of this video is to lay out a challenge that can get in the way of putting pillar number 2 into practice. So I don't want to emphasize this pillar as a tactic for recovery without explaining also how to overcome this obstacle to exercising it. If you find it difficult to unmute and act upon your evaluations of others, then I can recommend therapy. In long-term therapy, you don't have to compromise your evaluation of the therapist to save the bond between the two of you. The therapist will be working as hard as you to keep the relationship going and working. That's not what a scapegoat child found with their narcissistic parent. In that case, the child learns that the relationship survival lies entirely with them. If the child offends or fails to give what the parent thinks they're owed, then the parent is going to have no trouble dissolving the relationship. But in therapy, this reciprocal effort to keep the relationship going can gradually convince you that it may be safer to evaluate your therapist than it was your parent. And if it's safe to evaluate your therapist, then it might be safe to evaluate others in your life. As you work in therapy and describe how you feel in the relationships in your life, you will likely find validation for your experience. Your therapist will likely find it to be well within your rights to question how people treat you. Instead of being shamed or rebuked for taking your evaluations of others seriously, you find support. The therapist's ability to hold up to your evaluations and normalize your right to evaluate others can signal that you are now, finally, perhaps, safe to do this. When you can reconnect with what you really think about others, then it becomes a lot easier to move away from those that you evaluate to be unsafe and to move closer to those whom you evaluate to be safe. The good news, too, is that the scapegoat survivors who've gone through this process aren't left with no one, as they may have feared earlier. They may have fewer friends or partners for a time, but these friends will no doubt treat them far better than the friends or partners they lost through honest evaluation. Let's go back once more to Chris. By the time he was 30, he knew that he needed help if he was ever going to feel like the author of his own life. So he found a therapist in his insurance network and began attending on a weekly basis. Chris liked his therapist. Her name was Kira, and Chris had a good feeling about her when he was in session. Chris would talk about his guilt over severing his friendship with Harry. He was surprised to find that she understood and validated his experience in relation to Harry. This was Chris's first piece of evidence in the therapy that he might be safer to evaluate others than he had thought all his life. In the first year of their therapy, all of the evidence that it was safer to evaluate others pertained to people outside of therapy. Kira's continued validation of his experience began suggesting to Chris that he might even be safe to evaluate her one day. Of course, Chris didn't think this consciously. Rather, all clients search for evidence that it's now safe to do what they really want to do, but has been too dangerous to do to date. This search usually happens unconsciously, and in control mastery theory, they call it the client's unconscious plan. In Chris's case, he was searching for evidence in the therapeutic relationship that Kira could withstand his evaluation of her so that he could reclaim his ability and use it to find safe people. So in the 14th month of therapy, Chris must have been feeling safe enough to find out if Kira was safe to evaluate. Chris had experienced most of his sessions as consisting of all bonding feelings and no evaluation of Kira. But after that day's session, he kept thinking about a moment in the session when she seemed distracted. He was telling her about a coworker who he didn't like, and she put her hand over her mouth, seemingly to disguise a yawn. When he was done telling her about how this coworker had taken credit for a project where he had done most of the work, she replied in a way that signaled to Chris that she hadn't been paying attention. Kira said, "So you thought that she gave you too much credit, huh?" So Chris clarified the point of his story to her, but he held back something very important. He wanted to ask, "Hey, weren't you even listening to me? I come here every week and pay you good money, and you didn't even seem to be paying attention." But everything was happening too fast in the session to have thought and said this at the moment. Yet on his drives to and from work for the subsequent week, this episode kept coming into Chris's mind. Privately, he thought to himself, "What gives? She's always listened to me. This seems very unlike her. But it did feel good when she did that, and I can't convince myself that she didn't mean it or whatever. Seems like I have to respect myself enough to bring this up next session." After he formed this intention, he'd be racked by a lot of counter thoughts like, "Well, she's a therapist. Of course she was listening. I tend to see things that aren't there, and if I go ahead and ask her about this, then she could get angry for making a false accusation and maybe even kick me out of therapy." But these kinds of thoughts, for the first time in his life, didn't fully deter him from speaking to Kira about his concern. At the start of next session, he willed himself to say, "You know, I thought a lot about our last session, and there was a point where I didn't feel like you were listening to me. Do you happen to remember that?" And Kira said, "I think I have some idea, but could you tell me from your perspective how I seemed? I'd really like to understand what it was like for you." And Chris said, "Okay, so I was telling you about Joe at work, and you seemed like you were tired and didn't keep track of what I was saying to you." And Kira said, "Okay, yes, I wholly remember now. How was it for you when I did that?" Chris felt invited to say more. He said, "Well, it did feel good to have to question whether you were listening to me or not. I want to be able to assume that you are. I mean, that's the contract we have in here. But then as I thought more about it, it worried me because I didn't know if I should wonder if you're ever listening to me. If that were the case and I were to find out by asking you about it, then I'd have to leave therapy and that would be a huge loss." Kira said, "Of course, Chris. It was understandably hurtful when I lost track of what you were telling me last week. I think it's really important that you are bringing it up with me instead of managing your feelings about it all on your own. You're holding me accountable for how I participate in our relationship and telling me about a way I acted that you really didn't like, and appropriately so. Although I wish I hadn't done something to hurt you or disappoint you, I do feel privileged that you're telling me about it because it gives me a chance to try to make things right. And to get to your main point, you're right. I was tired at our last meeting because of something in my life completely unrelated to you and what you were saying. I had thought that I could be present for you like usual, but that wasn't the case, and I'm sorry. You deserve to take for granted that I'm alert and actively listening to you throughout the session. Going forward, I'm going to try to be more aware if I feel more tired than usual, and if I am, then I'll work to do something about that. Chris was surprised and relieved that Kira was so accepting of his evaluation of her behavior towards him. She didn't question his conclusion, instead she acted upon it. This session was instrumental towards Chris learning that he can safely evaluate people he's close to. On the occasions where Kira did or didn't do something that Chris didn't like, he would tell her, and she would take what he said seriously and sincerely work to make things different. Chris now had a frame of reference for how he wanted people to respond to his honest evaluations. He began to apply this expectation to others in his life. He found himself moving much slower to getting into friendships and relationships. He would keep his initial feelings of bonding about a person in check long enough to see how they were over time and situations. He'd no longer mute his own evaluative thoughts about someone when they showed a pattern of behavior that he didn't like. And he felt entitled to act on these thoughts as he saw fit, without undue guilt. If he didn't think the person could productively hear and respond to his concerns like Kira did, then he might just move away from them. And if he thought they might respond more like his therapist, then he would tell them. More often than not, this would work, and these people appreciated him sharing his feelings. These kinds of outcomes from Chris's evaluations led to a life that became populated with more safe people while excluding those who were unsafe. Well, I hope you found today's video helpful if this question of how to evaluate others resonates with you. And I want to thank everyone for your continued support and engagement with this channel. And with that, I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.